Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Last year, I had the great joy of interviewing then debut novelist Julietta Henderson about her divinely heartwarming book, The Funny Thing About Norman Foreman. I still remember the moment I finished reading it and thinking, wow, that book was special. So when I learned about Julietta's new book, Sincerely Me, I knew I couldn't pass up the opportunity to chat again. Filled with Julietta's trademark warmth and humour, Sincerely Me was a brilliant, hopeful read, shining a light on families in all shapes and sizes and the debilitating effects of grief. Another must-read from a supremely talented writer. Welcome back to the podcast, Julietta.
Oh, thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Claudine. I remember last time we spoke as well, and it was equally lovely. It's so nice to hear those lovely things about yourself, and it's really nice to be here again with you.
Oh, I'm so delighted, and I want to say congratulations on book number 2.
Thank you. It's kind of weird, but I've lined them up and I've taken a couple of photos together, and it's like when you've got 2 books, can you actually, I think I can call myself a real author now, and it's quite it is quite amazing, because after the first one you think, oh, was that just a fluke? And you know, my favorite thing to say is the first one took me 50 years to write, and the second one I had to write in a year, sort of thing, but which it wasn't really. It was more like 16, 17 months. It's quite a nice feeling to have 2 out.
Oh, bless. You are most definitely an author, my friend. Don't ever doubt it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Not that you need me to tell you, but anyway.
Oh, I need all the help I can get, all the praise I can get. We love it.
Oh, that's wonderful. To say that Norman Foreman was a hit is likely an understatement, but I wondered if, when you were thinking about writing book number 2, you thought, I can't follow this up with a story as charming or as widely acclaimed. Or did you already know that you were going to write about Danny and Wolfie and felt sure that we'd love them just as much?
Look, I did. I did obviously have those concerns, because, you know, that's the flip side of having a book that is well received, is that then, especially, well, definitely if it's your debut, because then it's, you know, the difficult second album thing. But I think, luckily for me, I was getting so many queries from people saying, oh, you're writing a sequel to Norman. And I knew I was never writing a sequel to Norman at that time. I don't mean never, but I mean, I wasn't writing a sequel to Norman straight after, that's for sure. And because I already had these other characters, it's very crowded up there in my head. There's a lot of characters waiting to have their time in the sun. It was so different that I didn't ever, rightly or wrongly, I didn't ever really have those concerns about following it, because it really came out of me. So it came out so easily. And because I think too, you know, I think I might be one of those annoying people that says the pandemic helped me in a way, because it forced me, and, you know, and people do say, of course, for a writer, oh, it was your dream come true. And in a way it was, because my schedule didn't really change much. I get up, I go for a walk, I sit at home and I write. But the fact that I lost all my paid work, shall we say, I lost basically all of it. And suddenly I had, you know, 24 hours a day to write fiction and write to a contract, because I had a 2-book deal. And so you'd think that was your dream come true, but actually it just made for another 23 hours of procrastination throughout the day, to be honest. But I think it was good for me, because I had this freedom of nothing else to do really except write. And I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And these characters just, the story didn't appear straight away, but the characters were so there that I didn't ever have that worry, oh, am I living up to Norman, because I was so deep and far into them pretty much straight away. So it was luckily the distraction of nothing, I guess.
I love that. All right. So where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, my twisted imagination as usual, but again, as usual, the characters definitely come to me before a plot does. I'm very much character driven, and I really wanted to write a story about siblings, but adult siblings, because I'm really interested in that, in the aspect of that where you sit in your family, whether you're the youngest, the oldest, the brother, the sister, even the gap in age between you, how that affects the way that you're brought up, the way your parents react to you, the way you react to your parents and your siblings. I'm really interested in, and it's my little theory, but I really, it's probably not my theory, but I've taken it on. I do think that you take that with you into adulthood as well, and of how you interact with, colleagues, friends socially, and your partner, and your own children and all of that. And I think it really does sort of shape your life. And so I had wanted to write it. Well, I did want to write a story in some way about that. But when I started to write, it was originally going to be, so it's a dual narrative, a dual point of view, again, as was Norman. But it was to be between Danny, the first person, Danny Mulberry, and his sister Lou. But I very quickly, when I started writing, and Wolfie, who's Danny's niece, came into the picture really quickly, like probably, within a few weeks of grappling with Lou's voice, I realized that the reason I was grappling with it was because Wolfie needed her voice. And I really didn't want a book with 3 different points of view. So then I sort of flipped everything on its head. And so the point of views became between Danny and the niece. And also I didn't ever intend, I mean, you have read Sincerely Me, and it's he sort of, this guy who's a bit of a, no-hoper, and he's sort of, he could do better in every aspect of his life. But I wanted him to have a transformation, and I didn't go out with the purpose of him turning into this accidental guru, which he does throughout the book. But I wanted him to have a transformation, and it got me thinking that, how much of a transformation could it be? Like, there's a guy who can't really take care of himself. He's not brave enough to look into his own past and realize why his life is drifting the way it is. And suddenly he's put into a situation where people are looking to him for advice. How much more of a transformation can you get? So that's where the accidental guru-y type of thing came along. The other themes that are in the book, grief, as you said, and, mental health, as with, I think I always will, I like to touch on those complex themes, but I like to touch on them with a light touch, because I think, there's a lot of really good, excellent, and heartbreaking, probably true books out there that are that delve very deeply into mental health issues. But I think that there's not really any of us who doesn't, whether it's within your own family, whether it's yourself, whether it's close friends or colleagues or whatever, we all know it's a part of life. But I didn't want to write a book about somebody with depression. I wanted to write a book about the people that surround and love somebody who has mental health issues or depression or anxiety and things like that. So that was my intention.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I was just thinking about something that I learned so long ago when you were talking about the relationships between siblings. I once heard a parenting expert, he actually came to the law firm that I was working at, and he spoke to us about birth order, the importance of birth order
Wow.
on how a child's personality forms. So first children had a particular personality type. Second children and the youngest children,
Yeah.
third children in particular. I always laughed at that because my husband is a third child.
Okay. Yeah.
And the things that he spoke about really resonated with me. It made me understand his character a little bit more, and it made me understand myself a little bit more as a firstborn.
Oh, that's really interesting. See, I knew it wasn't my own theory, but I'm a little sister. I don't go through life thinking I'm a little sister. And my sister's a big sister, but I think you just approach things differently. And yes, you're so right. As that guy said, your personality is being formed as you're a kid. And in the book, Sincerely Me, we do go back into their childhood. He remembers stuff, and it's really interesting. It was really interesting to go back and, remember what it was like to be the younger, in his case, he's the older brother, and she was the quite a bit younger, or, 5 or 6 years younger sibling. And the feel, I never knew those feelings. And I haven't spoken with my sister about it, but she messaged me last night, actually. And she said, I've just finished. And she said, wow, it brought up some really complex emotions in me. And I was thinking, I wonder what they were. But, so I know what it was like to be a younger sister. And so, yeah, it was really interesting to go back and try and remember all that sort of stuff.
I think we've kind of talked around the plot of this story a little bit.
Yes.
So for the benefit of the listeners out there who haven't read your book yet, can you tell us a little bit more about the story?
Yeah, so at its heart, I think my elevator pitch sort of thing is that it's about family at its heart, and it's about second chances. But mainly, I think it is about the power of forgiveness, and on both sides, and giving second chances on both sides. So Danny Mulberry is a guy who, like I said, he could do better in all aspects of his life. He drinks a little bit too much. He can't keep down a job. He can't really sustain a relationship, or he's chosen not to. And at the age of nearly 40, he's ended up living in his best mate's garden shed, but albeit of a very posh house in a very posh suburb in London called Belsize Park. But then one day, the consequences of a drunken evening, it comes to the attention of the press, and a misleading story and also very misleading photograph appear in a local London paper. And suddenly all these people up and down the country start to think that Danny is something and someone that he's not, and they start to write in via the paper looking for advice from him. And alongside that, someone else sees the paper, and that's his niece, Wolfie, who he doesn't even know exists because he's been estranged from his younger sister for many, many years. And so within the space of a week or so, he goes from being this guy who's a bit of a party guy, the world's oldest child sort of thing. And he goes from that and having no responsibilities to being, a big brother again, a uncle, and this accidental guru to a lot of very lost and lonely souls. How he faces up to that. I mean, that's the tagline of the book, is can he become the man they all need him to be? And that's the question we find along his journey.
Indeed. Such a wonderful, wonderful story. You kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, and I kind of thought that Danny was what we might call a larrikin character. He was mischievous or prone to getting himself into mischief, certainly. But we soon learn that there's a great sadness lying at the heart of all his failures, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, and in fact, I'm glad that's exactly as I like to portray him. He's sort of fallen into this lifestyle because he's not facing up to his past. And as we all know, like if you have an estrangement from a family member, there's usually something deep at its core, but oftentimes it could be a misunderstanding. And so Danny, I actually read a review the other day that called Danny a chronic alcoholic, and I was appalled, because I was like, no, he's not. That you've kind of misinterpreted. He's not that. He's just a lost kind of soul who's turning. He's hiding inside his antics and his party lifestyle and things like that. But what I really do like about how the plot went, I'm the classic pantser, as they like to call you. I don't know what's going along, but throughout the book, as Danny becomes this guru and starts to, at first he gets these letters, and he's doing it for the money. He's been offered £300 to answer a few letters, and he's like, well, why not? At first he's very flippant about it, and he's like, well, how can I ever give advice? And so he uses his trademark humor and covering up of stuff, which he's done in his own life. He's used humor and partying to sort of cover up why he is like he is. Very soon he starts to realize the responsibility that he's been given, and he reads these letters and wants to do the right thing. But the brilliant thing about it is that he digs so deep, he has to go back into his own past to be able to give answers. And what I like about it is that, without giving anything away, yes, he does give some really good advice, but all the sort of stuff that he's grappling with is actually it's been inside him all the time, and it just takes him to face up to his past. And so that's the story about as how his sister and niece are now back in his life, and he has to face all the stuff as to why they weren't in the first place and stuff. And so the people, I use a phrase that I really liked. I kind of wanted to use it at one stage. I loved this phrase so much. I wanted to use it in the title, but that soon got booted out the window. But he uses the phrase useful strangers in the book. And I find, we've all come across a useful stranger in our life at a good time or a bad time, where someone will say something, someone on a bus, or someone at a bus seat, or someone in a pub, or a friend you're just chatting to will say something that resonates with you that can actually change the path of your, without being too dramatic, it can actually change the path of your life. And so I like that he's a useful stranger but these strangers are useful to him as well.
You mentioned earlier that the book is written from two points of view. You've got Danny's
Mm.
and Wolfie's, and
Mm.
between them, we unearth the family secrets and what led to the estrangement between Danny and his sister Lou.
Mm.
So I wanted to ask you, were either of these characters inspired by a real life person?
No, not at all. And people love to ask me that about my characters because they're kind of like, oh, yeah. I mean, I suppose every author gets that actually. Oh,
Yeah.
dish the dirt. Absolutely not. Whereas both, you know, I don't know what it says about me, but both voices came very easily to me, like writing as a man. I set myself that challenge. I knew I was going to do that. Even though I'd written as a young boy,
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of a different thing to write as a man. And I really wanted to set myself that challenge. And I thought I was going to temper it with writing in Lou's voice. And so at least that would be closer to me. And, and that would give me a bit of light relief. But instead I chose to write as a 15-year-old girl. So I don't know where I went. But they're not based on, no, neither of them are based on anybody. The only thing that I can say is real is the name Mulberry. I mean, it's a very unusual name, and
Yes.
that works into the plot well because, his niece found him out of, she didn't even know he existed, and then suddenly, but she recognized the surname because that was her mother's maiden name. But that I was walking, as you do, I was walking through a graveyard. I was walking through a graveyard in London a few years ago. I think I was still writing Norman, or Norman might have just been going to come. Anyway, it was sort of maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and I was walking through a graveyard, and I saw this gravestone with the name Mulberry on it. And I just thought, I think it's because I grew up with a mulberry tree, and we used to eat mulberries until we were purple in the face sort of thing. And so it really appealed to me. And I was like, I'm going to use that in a book one day. And so I did. And so the name, I don't know where the Danny came from, but the name Danny Mulberry was right there in my head. And I wrote, but the interesting, nice, lovely story about it is, the book came out. I've been back to that gravestone since because it's quite near where I stay when I go to London. And then a couple of weeks ago, just after the book had just come out, and a friend of mine was going to London, and she took the book to the graveyard and she plonked it next to it and took photos and stuff like that, which I haven't shared on social media because that's not very nice for the family. This is probably a bit of an invasion of privacy, but it was so nice. So yes, to answer your question, no, there's really no. I mean, I guess Danny is every guy that I've ever known, or that any of us have ever known, really. And funnily enough, you'll get this because you've read the book. But if people are listening and they haven't read the book, they'll get it when they do read it. There's another character, obviously Dom, who is his best friend, and who is, isn't he Mr. Lovely, nicest guy in the world? And my mum, after my mum read it, she said to me, she sent me a message. She said, you tell me, if Dom rang you up and asked you to come and spend the rest of your life with him and George, would you do it? And I was just thinking, no, but I would with Danny. I was just thinking, it's so interesting how different people appeal. And I did say that. I remember saying to my agent when she first read the book, and she said, oh, I love Danny, but gosh, he's a bit of a mess, isn't he? And I said, yeah, do you know what? I think I was writing Danny for me because he was a bit of a mess. But, when you see the good in someone, and I love a bit of unpolished diamond sort of thing, the good in people, and you like to look for the good in people. So right from the start, I think when you start to read Danny, like from the first couple of pages, you're like, okay, who's this guy? But a friend of mine did say that she said, and by the end of that first chapter, she goes, I was actually already in love with Danny. She said, at first I thought, oh my God, what?
Yeah.
And then she said, no, I could see that little bit of good in him. So
I saw more than a little bit of good in Danny,
good.
just the way that he interacted with both Dom and George. It doesn't take long before you can see that he's only the way he is because of this great sadness
Yeah.
that he holds in his heart. And obviously, when we meet Wolfie, we learn more. Speaking of Wolfie, she was a beautiful character, and her voice was so strong. But she also carried a great deal on her young shoulders, didn't she?
Yeah, and I think, I've got quite a few friends, and it didn't strike me at first that I've written 2 books about single parents. It really didn't strike me at first, but there you go. It struck me after a while. I was like, oh, same, But I think that's a really interesting relationship when it's a one-child family and a single parent, and I remember saying this in interviews about Norman. Norman and Sadie were each other's heroes because they had to be. And in this, I think it's it goes back to that thing I was saying about not wanting to write a story about someone with depression. And so I consciously wrote Lou a little bit kind of off the page, like she's there and she's central to the story, but she doesn't have her own voice now, and we hear that from people around her. And I think that's why I wanted to show just how that relationship, that parental relationship, if it is a single child and a single parent, and the parent does have problems, how that child has to grow up quickly or take on a role. And, obviously straight away, like Wolfie has taken on that, rightly or wrongly. I mean, Lou is not a complete mess or anything like that, but Wolfie has, as children do, I think they take on this worry, and she's taken on the role of thinking she has to protect and look after her mother. That's a big weight for small shoulders. But on the other side of it, it develops a character that's very strong, and it develops I love Wolfie's voice as well. Like, I think she's quite dark and cheeky, and she's not like I was when I was 15, but I think she's like how I would have liked to have been.
Indeed, quite self-sufficient and she has a strong sense of responsibility.
Yeah, she definitely does. She does. And she does have a father, but he's not in the picture, sort of thing. She has support around her, but she's so in her own head, she's taken on everything. She sort of takes on the world, and she faces up to it as well. She takes it on, and she's done a great job.
As I mentioned in my introduction, much like in The Funny Thing About Norman Foreman, you've delved into grief and indeed into depression and its debilitating effects, not only on those who suffer from it, but those around them. Probably already answered this. Obviously, this was a deliberate ploy on your part, but why? Why was this important for you to explore in this novel?
Yeah, I think I hope I always will, because I think it's the books I like to read to have a meaning, to have something behind them, a bit of substance, but also just because of the person that I am, I do like to have a bit of humour as well. I just think it's never going to be a book. It's never going to be like a poster about a sort of, a poster girl about depression or anything like that, like Sorrow and Bliss or something like that, that is, it's quite overtly that. But I think by not having it as, say, the main theme or the overwhelming, everything in the book is about the feeling and what happens in depression, I think by having it almost just running through it as a vein, as a background, I think that's quite realistic, because I think that's what life is. And I would like to think that people would read it and think, oh God, well, maybe I'll think about so-and-so whose mother was a bit interesting and things like that, and how their life might have been. And so I think it's because it's I think it's just because it's so prevalent. Yeah, as I said, I wouldn't want it to be a poster book for depression or anything like that, but that it's there, it's out there, and it needs dealing with and things like that. So yeah.
I think what I love about this book is that, once again, like with Norman Foreman, you've tapped into these feelings with such tenderness and sensitivity, even though it's not the main theme of the book. How do you do this? How do you tap into those feelings and get inside, say, Wolfie's head or Danny's head?
Oh, it actually comes very easily. I don't know, again, what that says about me, but I sort of do, like when I write, I do have to be in the right frame of mind. And then I think I just drift off, like when you're a kid and you're doing daydreams and things like that. I think I just drift off and imagine what it would be like to be in those situations. I find it quite easy. I have quite a visual imagination. So I think the way that I write, I imagine a scene as a little vignette from a movie. And then I write everything, to whatever's in the background and whatever. I just think, oh, I've seen that as a movie in my head, and I sort of then will write that. But I do find it quite easy, and I always do wonder what that says about me.
You're an empathetic person.
I guess, yeah. And you know what? That's probably quite true, because I do, often to the detriment, and this makes me sound like a really, holier than thou, but I do sometimes empathize. I can put myself in someone's position really easily, almost to the detriment of myself, because you think, oh, that person, oh, I don't want her to feel like that, and so I won't say or do a certain thing. That can obviously be very nice. That's just kindness, really. But sometimes if I can see how an action of one person would affect another person, I try and avoid that. So it is empathy. You're right. Yeah, which is lovely. Thank you for pointing that out.
My absolute pleasure. Julietta, you also have the marvelous ability to create a cast of brilliantly drawn characters, or supporting characters, that is. We have Dom and George that we've mentioned before. We have Ray the neighbour and Pete the journo, as well as Lou, of course. Where do you draw inspiration for these other characters? And do you know who they're going to be when you start out, or do they just show up on the page?
They really do show up on the page. I remember when Ray showed up, I was just imagining, I guess it was one of those little vignettes. I was just imagining Danny in his back shed doing something ridiculous. And I thought, oh, there's got to be someone watching him. And then I thought, what's better than a nosy neighbor? And then you don't want to be too cliched, so he's not a nosy neighbor. And, Ray has his whole own story that never got in the book. And poor old Ray, Ray's actually a lovely old bloke, although he doesn't seem it in the book. But
Yeah.
you get a glimpse of it at the end. But yeah, people just seem to walk on and walk off. And again, it's that movie sort of vignette thing, because you can't have an empty set if it was in a movie. So people have got to walk on and off, and you just, honestly, maybe I am a little bit, I'm sure, well, you're a writer. I'm sure this must happen to you as well. But if you're imagining something and somebody walks past and you go, oh yeah, who can that person be? And that person turns into, and that's exactly what happened with Ray. Like, I wanted some guy to see Danny, I don't know, like having a wee in the back garden or something, which is what he did in the winter and things like that. And I wanted someone to see it. And so Ray evolved from that.
Yeah. He was just gorgeous. I almost imagined, I don't know if this is probably, a Mrs. Jessup, poking her nose over the backyard fence. Oh God, that was hilarious.
I love people who can still remember Mrs. Jessup. That makes me laugh.
Well, it makes me sound old, right?
No, well, it makes me feel younger again. Like, aha, she knows Mrs. Jessup. We still say it. So, oh, you're being a Mrs. Jessup these days. That was a great character. Imagine having written the Sullivans and having written Mrs. Jessup. Like, you don't remember any of it. Well, you probably do, but you remember Mrs. Jessup, don't you?
I certainly do. Now, reflecting on your books, each has been set in the UK. And I know you divide your time between the UK and here, or you have in the past, certainly. But why do you set your books there? And do you think this story could have worked as well as if it was set here in Australia?
Well, the reason I set my books there, my primary publishing deal is with Penguin in the Transworld in the UK. And I happened to be living there when I first started writing Norman. And then I am starting again, I hope, go back and forwards between the two. I spent so much of my formative life in the UK that it just comes naturally. And I think the humour in the UK and Australia is very, very similar. But it's definitely not to say that I would not be writing a book in Australia. And I mean, I think I definitely will.
Yeah.
I just haven't at the moment. But yes, I think that someone said to me, actually, oh, you could have written Norman as a little kid that goes from Cairns down to the Melbourne Fringe Festival. And I said, yeah, I could have. This one, again, I think it's the characters, because the characters immediately, Danny, when he came into my head, he was a Brit. He really was. And I wanted him to live in. And also, I don't know that I probably could say he lived in a garden shed in Vaucluse, but I don't think and it's a good thing. I don't think we quite have the division of class in this country that there is in the UK. And I really wanted him to be in a super posh neighbourhood that people would recognise as being very posh, and he doesn't belong there. So there is that. But really, it's I would say it's the characters, and they sort of tell me where they're from. But yeah, I'm definitely at some stage I will. The next book again is written halfway through. Well, I'm not halfway through. I wish I was. That's just wishful thinking. I'm well into book 3, and again that's set in the UK, but it's a love story, so it could be anywhere. It just happens to be, I'm writing things and it just happens to be in the UK. So, but yeah, definitely for the future, there's so much. And especially just the last few days I've spent traveling around regional Victoria doing some events at libraries and things. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I was traveling with my publicist, and every time we'd leave somewhere, I was like, well, there's book 3, there's book 4, there's book 5. These people I was meeting in, the regional libraries that would come to these events of mine. It was, it's an absolute little melting pot of creative inspiration out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love it.
Yeah.
Last time we spoke, I asked you about writing tips for writers who listen in. And this time I wondered if you might shed some light on the things that you've learned about yourself as a writer that you didn't know before Norman Foreman was published.
Yes, I didn't know how to write a book. And it was really interesting because as soon as Norman was published, people started asking me what my writing process was, and I was like, I don't know, I don't have one, because it took me so long and I just did it. But this time I've got more of a process, and I think the third time now I feel like I know how to write a book now. Like the second time, it was very different because I was writing to a contract and to a deadline, although they never ever pressured me on that. And that was possibly because it was the pandemic and things like that. But it was a very different experience. And so, but I think you have to find your own. I mean, I listen to so many podcasts like yours and on writing and things like that. And there's so many different pieces of advice of people who plan. I listened to one yesterday, and this guy was Alex Michaelides, who wrote The Silent Patient. It was such a good interview, but he plans for months and months before he even puts pen to paper. He writes an outline, and he writes like a 10,000 word outline and stuff like that. Whereas I couldn't possibly do that. But I just think you have to find your own way. I mean, and I still, even though I've got 2 books out, I still don't feel any more qualified than anyone else who writes, whether they're published or not. I don't feel any more qualified to give advice, except the only piece of advice, which is definitely not original advice, is just write until the end. Just get in there, just write until the end. I think it was Stephen King, the best piece of advice that I've ever read is the first draft is just telling yourself the story. So just let go of any preconceptions and the other. Well, I'm coming up with all advice now, but this isn't mine, but this is very useful. And I actually did have this in front of me for this second book, which was decide how you want your readers to feel and write towards that. And I always wanted my readers to feel hope. I wanted them to feel sad. I wanted them to feel happy. I wanted them to feel challenged, and I wanted them to feel engaged. And I had those words. See, I know them off by heart. I had those words. And at every stage, particularly when I was editing, at every stage I was writing towards that. And that was sort of like, your North Star or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thank you. Again, as I said, that's not my original advice. I wish it was, but it's easy advice to follow, and it's easy advice to remember as well.
Julietta, if there was one thing you'd like readers to take away from this book, what would it be?
It would be the feeling of hope and the feeling of, and as I circling back right to what the book is about, is the power of forgiveness. Really, it's so powerful. It's so powerful for yourself, for the other person, for a situation. It's just, obviously not everything in life is forgivable, but I think forgiveness is something that frees you completely. Like it's absolutely so freeing to you.
You've said that you're working on another book. Can you give us any clues?
Well, I wish someone could give me a clue. It's a love story, but it's a love story, again, it's almost a cliche to say it's a love story with a difference, but it really is with a difference. It's a sort of a very grown up love story, and it covers 25 years from when people meet until a certain event. So it's very different for me. It's written just one point of view this time, so I'm carrying that through. And I'm really, really, really enjoying writing it. I love it.
Have you ever thought about maybe picking up Norman Foreman's story again?
Yeah, definitely, because so many people have asked me. And I think I probably said to you, because my standard answer back when I was promoting that was I didn't know about whether writing another book about Norman, but I definitely hadn't finished with Leonard because I love Leonard. But since then, look, there is a little bit of an itch of Norman, but I think it would have to be probably another 2-3 books time, because he's still, in my mind, he's still young. 12. And I think he'd have to be quite a bit older. And I also say, maybe I'll make him grow up and he'll be an accountant, or maybe I'll write a thriller and make him a murderer. Oh no, I couldn't do that. I think it would have to be something. I think I'd have to come up with a pretty good and absolutely right for Norman's storyline to go there again, because I wouldn't want to write the same book again. Now he's off to Montreal or something like that. I think it would be easy to do that, and it would probably be quite funny and quite sweet. But I think he needs to grow up a little bit, and I think it definitely hasn't come to me yet, but I think that there would be a story for him out there when he's a little bit older, not as a grown man or anything like that, but, probably 19, 20 or something like that. And then we can delve into how his past affected his future. So there's always a chance. Strangely, I think it was either my agent or it was someone in the UK who only just read Sincerely Me and sent me a message and said, "Oh my gosh, I've just had this amazing thought. Is Danny Norman's father?" You know what he could be. I don't know.
Oh my God, talk about serendipitous.
I know. The timings don't really work, but anyway, you never know. We can always crowbar them in.
Food for thought there.
Yeah.
Julietta, if listeners wanted to connect with you and learn more about you and your books, where can they do that?
They can find me on my website, which is just juliettahenderson.com, and I am on Twitter, but I'm sporadically on Twitter. It's not my favorite space. I only go there to read abuse, I think, of other people. It's awful. But I am on Instagram at Julietta Henderson Author, and I do try and anyone who messages me, I get back to them and stuff. So I'm trying. I'm quite interactive on that, and I love to hear from readers. So anyone, feel free to question me and ask me things. And also, because both books are actually very good book club books, so I've actually zoomed into a few book clubs of people when they've asked me and stuff, and I actually really enjoy that. And so anything like that, I'm really happy to connect with readers at any time.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Julietta, such a joy to speak with you about Danny, Wolfie, Lou, Dom and George and this wonderful book. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books yet again.
Thank you, Claudine. Thanks so much for having me.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.